Well, hi everybody. Today I'll be going over the Asobo Carenado GB. I'll be focusing on the R2 mostly in the tutorial. I find it to be the slightly more difficult one of the two. Not that either one of them are really difficult to fly, but if I were to pick one, I would say the R2 is a little bit more difficult. But I'll talk about both of them in the review. So let's go ahead and get started. Alright, well, welcome to the GB. This is pretty much it. Now this is the R2 version. The Z does look different here in the cockpit. It has a different instrument panel layout, and most of the other things in here are different. Both of them do look really good. So, and they do behave a little bit differently from one another. So it's not just a different model for the exterior model and the interior model. It actually has slightly different flight characteristics. Not drastic, but there is a difference. Now, as far as features go for this thing, there really aren't any. You can open the door, and that's it. So with that out of the way, we'll go ahead and run through the instrument panel here and get it started. Alright, well, starting up here in the left-hand corner, we've got a clock. We've got your manifold pressure and fuel pressure on this gauge. Manifold pressure is on the left, and fuel pressure is on the right. We've got a RPM gauge, fuel gauge, airspeed indicator, oil pressure, oil temperature, and cylinder head temperature. Moving over here to the center, at the top, we've got the directional gyro, attitude indicator, your transponder and radio. Then we've got on the right side here your altimeter, climb indicator, heading compass, and amp meter. And then we've got an accelerometer here on the far right. Moving back over here to the left, we've got a starter button, nav lights, alternator, primer, boost pump, battery, and magnetos. And then down here, kind of on the left side of the cockpit, we've got the throttle, mixture lever, propeller pitch, and fuel selector. Now this thing only has one tank, and it seems to, by default, always be set to that tank, so you shouldn't really have to worry about the fuel selector when starting this thing up. But that's pretty much it, so we'll get it started. Alrighty, so we'll go ahead and make sure the mixture is up at rich and the propeller pitch is up at max. We'll go ahead and crack the throttle just a little bit. You don't really need to, but it's kind of a habit. Flip the battery on, flip the alternator on, turn the boost pump on. Come over here and flip the magnetos over to both. Now you don't have to prime it, but I kind of do out of habit. Then we'll hit the starter button. And there we go. Got the GB started. So we'll go ahead and head out to the runway. Alrighty, well, right here in the grass today. Part of that is because, well, one, the wind is in this direction, but this thing, when you release the parking brake, is going to roll, even if the throttle's at 0, and even if the propeller pitch is at its minimum, it's still going to roll, which doesn't seem to happen in the grass. So that's why I'm out here. Now, I will say that this thing can kind of get away from you while you're taxiing it if you're not paying attention to it. It does like to kind of get up and go. It can pretty quickly be up to, I don't know, like maybe 30 miles an hour or so in no time. But it is a little bit squirrely on takeoff. It's not terrible. You know, just kind of don't apply the throttle too quickly. It is a pretty overpowered little plane. So go ahead here and release the parking brake, and we'll throttle up here to about 75%. The tail should lift off the ground at about 50, 60 miles an hour. Now it probably won't actually lift off the ground until you get to about 120. Now the R2, at least from what I've noticed, it seems to be much more nose heavy than the Z version of this. The Z feels a little bit lighter than this one does, and I think it makes it a little bit easier to take the Z off and actually land the Z. Now, stall speed for the R2 here is going to be something like around about 90 miles an hour. The Z is going to be closer to, what is it? About 80, maybe. Now, there isn't a manual, so I just kind of tested that out for a little bit. They do behave differently. In the air, they're not quite so different. Most of the sort of flight characteristics between the two are somewhat similar, but the Z really does kind of feel a little bit lighter. Now they do have sort of different overspeed limits. This one you can pretty much take up to about maybe 260, somewhere around like 250 to 260 miles an hour. The Z's is going to be somewhere around like 235 or 240, and it'll reach that pretty much under its own power at 100% throttle. You'll pretty easily overspeed the Z. The R2 isn't that hard to or isn't that easy to overspeed, but it will do it. Now there isn't any kind of engine damage on this thing, so you can pretty much run it at full throttle. And if you do, you can get 250 out of this thing, out of the R2 at least, pretty easily. But if you're kind of keeping it, I guess, kind of within the limits, you're probably going to be running around at about 240 miles an hour or so. So I will bring it in here for a landing and hope I can actually land it. I do find this thing to have the worst brakes of any plane in Microsoft Flight Simulator. It takes a long time to actually stop. So kind of keep that in mind when you're picking a runway. But it is, at least I find the R2 to be more difficult to actually land than the Z, and I think that mostly is just because the Z actually does stop in a shorter distance than the R2. And I do find it a little bit easier to land them in the grass because they slow down a little bit faster. But we'll probably come in here at about 130 miles an hour. You're going to have to kind of keep your speed up in this one for landing. But you'll want to touch down somewhere around 100 miles an hour. Now, it might start shuddering really bad, at least the canopy. It doesn't make the plane itself doesn't feel like it's shuddering, but the canopy gets just shuddering pretty bad. Just ignore that. Don't worry about it. It's not going to stall on you until about 80 miles an hour. Or, sorry, 90. Well, I don't know if I'm going to stop before the trees. Nope. Well, anyway, just make sure you got enough room to land, and you should be fine. Alrighty, you can pick the GB up from the marketplace for about $15. You get both the Model R2 and the Z, both of which are quite a bit of fun to fly. I did go check, and you can't race these things in the Reno Air Race add-on, which is somewhat unfortunate. I think this thing would be kind of fun to race at Reno. The texture and model quality are great. After all, it is Carenado, so it's going to look really good. I didn't find any problems with them either way, so overall, model and texture quality are pretty good. The sound quality is good. I mean, nothing's ever going to sound like the real thing, but I'm not going to complain about the sounds. Overall, they do sound pretty good. The startup's pretty good too. The flight model for the R2 is fairly nose heavy. I have found that I like flying it around with about a quarter of the fuel load. That doesn't really help out with the sort of nose heaviness of it, but I do kind of like it being a little bit lighter. It's pretty nimble, yet not very aerobatic. I wasn't really expecting it to perform like the pitch or the extra. Either way, though, it at least does a roll. You just might need to put some rudder into it to make it look nice. I still haven't done a nice loop yet. It tends to kind of just flop over at the apex of the loop, and it just really doesn't maintain enough speed in the climb to kind of do a nice one. But it does turn really well, which is useful for a racer. The rudder is pretty responsive. It can create some problems as far as like overcorrecting during takeoff goes, but overall it's pretty fun to fly. The Model Z, I think, is the easier one to fly. It seems to be a little bit more well-balanced than the R2, and it definitely is the easier one to take off and to land. It has a shorter braking distance, but not that much shorter. It will bleed a little bit more speed in a turn than the R2. Overall, I think the R2 is a little bit better than the Z. But the Z is a little bit more aerobatic than the R2, but not by much. Overall, I like both of them. I kind of like the R2 a little bit more just because it's faster. This thing is a lot of fun to fly, like 10 feet off the ground. It's a little hard to pick a favorite, but if you've got some spare money lying around for $15, it's not bad. The GB's brakes are pretty bad. It's not a complaint. I can't imagine this thing had very good brakes in the first place. I mean, this is the 1930s, so we're looking at, what, drum brakes? I guess I could be wrong about that. Maybe it did have discs. But I would assume that it had drums on it. Anyway, that's pretty much going to be it for today. So thanks for watching, y'all, and I hope there's a next time.